Chief Justice of the US, a gentleman called Thurgood Marshall. Somebody asked him, "How would you like to be remembered when you're no more?" And he's known to have said, "I want to be remembered as he did what he could with what he had." The discussion around potential is reduced to a yes no kind of a discussion. But I think the more nuanced or the richer discussion to have is potential for what? What's the direction in which you can play to your potential? Just like companies think about where to play, how to win, in the context of the business strategy, we all need to think about where to go and how to grow in the context of our life strategy. Very often we think of potential in one dimension. Was Sachin Tendulkar a great cricketer? Was Lata Mangeshkar a great singer? The point is all of us carry multiple identities, right? I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm a brother. Now, am I playing to potential across all these facets of my life?
Hello and welcome to Ink Shots, where we discuss writing, reading, and books. My guest this evening is Deepak Jayaraman, whose book Play to Potential, Lead a Full Life, Become the Best You was published recently by Penguin. Deepak is a juggler, literally and metaphorically. He's a prominent leadership coach. He's an executive advisor, and he's the host of his popular, successful podcast by the same name, Play to Potential, that he started in 2016. Deepak's work focuses on helping individuals and organizations unlock their full potential through a growth mindset. Welcome to Ink Shots, Deepak. I'm so happy that you took time out for this.
Thank you, Deepti, for having me. Look forward to the conversation.
Yes. So Deepak, first of all, congratulations on the book. I mean, you have a successful podcast that's been running from 2016. You've interviewed so many people and now you have this book here. So before we deep dive into what the book contains and, your writing process and how you came about it, the first question that pops into my mind when we talk about potential success is, what is potential? Like, who defines potential? Is it like, something that an outcome is validated only an outcome is validated by society? Do we say that's a measure of having successfully played to our potential?
You're starting on a very deep question, and we could keep going on it. I think if I go back to let's say my journey with the word potential, right? I think my initial introduction was in the world of physics, right? Potential energy and kinetic energy, right? You're on a swing, you go up a certain height, then the speed with which you come down depends on the height. So the kinetic energy, potential energy, and that's sort of one mental model, if you will. Then when I was a search consultant at Egon Zehnder, an executive search firm, we used to look at candidates in terms of their skills, their competencies, and potential. And by potential, we'd say, will this person grow to become a leader 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line? There we would look at four things. Is the person curious? Is learning about the world and about themselves in terms of being open to feedback? Is the person getting energy from connecting with people? Is the person connecting the dots? And is the person resilient? So in a way, we would look at these four and sort of discern if the person has the potential for the long term. And I think the nuance there I've also discovered is not potential in a binary sense, but potential for what? All of us have a potential for something. The question is not, very often it's sort of the discussion around potential is reduced to a yes no kind of a discussion. But I think the more nuanced or the richer discussion to have is potential for what? What's the direction in which you can play to your potential? And I think just like companies think about where to play, how to win in the context of the business strategy, we all need to think about where to go and how to grow in the context of our life strategy. So very often a big piece of potential is actually where to go. What is the playground where we play for us to bring the best version of ourselves? Then along the way in the podcast, one of my first guests was Vijay Amritraj, who actually gave me the most relatable definition of potential. He refers to a late African American Chief Justice of the US, a gentleman called Thurgood Marshall. Somebody asked him, how would you like to be remembered when you're no more? And he's known to have said, I want to be remembered as he did what he could with what he had. And somehow that stayed with me because its potential is contextual. We all have different resources, different genetics, different contexts, different financial situation, etc., etc. Given the cards we are dealt with, are we doing the best we can? Now, who's the best judge? I don't know. It's a very open-ended question, but at least the point I make is we all can strive to play to our potential. The only last bit I might add, Deepti, is over the last few years, I've also started thinking about potential in a little more of a multi-dimensional sense. Very often we think of potential in one dimension. Was Sachin Tendulkar a great cricketer? Was Lata Mangeshkar a great singer? And so on and so forth. But the point is, all of us carry multiple identities, right? I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm a brother, I'm a coach, I'm an author, I'm a podcaster. Now, am I playing to potential across all these facets of my life? And how do we go about doing it? In a way, that was sort of, I was trying to take a point of view and put it out in the book. But that's where my thinking is in my journey with the word potential.
Yes, it is. I mean, like as you said, you have to put it in context, and it has to be multidimensional. I mean, it can't be just one thing. We are not just one thing. The two things that stood out for me in the book, one was you have a chapter on self-awareness, right? And the other one is on for the FOMO factor. So a favorite quote of Bertrand Russell just comes to my mind, and it comes to my mind every time I'm on social media, is the trouble with the world is that the stupid are cocksure and the intelligent are full of doubt, right? So you talk about the paradox, and you also talk about the paradox of self-awareness, the distinction between how we see ourselves and how the other
Hmm.
looks at us, right?
Hmm.
Like you have worked, and even in your podcast, I think you have more than 100 guests so far, and
Yes.
worked with leaders. What do you think? How do they approach the skill of self-awareness? And what have you found about leaders, and self-awareness bit?
Hmm. Yeah, Deepti, I think what I notice is it's a bit like the simplest way to explain people's self evaluation on their awareness is like I call it the drunk person in the party syndrome, right? If you ask the drunk person in the party, "Are you drunk?" Very often they would say no, right? But the world around them very clearly can see that they are drunk. And I think even if I go back to when I started my coaching work, my initial assumption was the people that would choose to work with me were people that needed to work on their self awareness, people who weren't really self aware, who had a large gap to cover. But what I found was people that chose to work with me were people who were already quite high. I'm just sort of using these numbers just to make the point, who were probably on the 80th percentile, but they want to chip away at the remaining 20%. There's that sort of the hunger to chisel away at the remaining, and there's a curiosity about the 20%, and sort of there's a desire to minimize the blind spot. And therein lies the paradox, right? I feel the people who really need help often don't even know that they need help in terms of self-awareness. They're sort of oblivious. And there's another couple of scientists who've done a lot of work in this space called Dunning and Kruger. And there is a effect called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which basically goes back to the quote where the amateurs would have a misplaced understanding of confidence and competence. But the real experts and the real people who are at the top of the domain would show a certain humility and a certain characteristic of doubt, self-doubt around their expertise. And I find that playing out in the space of self-awareness very clearly. And that's what I mean by the paradox. And I think that's why even in the work I do, I say I work with growth-minded leaders. And what do I mean by that? People who are open to feedback, people who have a certain humility about the self-awareness. And only then what I've learned is change is possible. If the person doesn't, the sort of the flippant comment I make sometimes is, Houston, he has a problem, doesn't work with coaching. The starting point has to be, Houston, I have a problem. Then, I can help. Very often, sometimes the HR head or the company CEO will nominate somebody to go through a coaching process. But if that person is not enrolled, or if that person believes that he or she doesn't need help, then there's no way you can help that person. So I think that's my perspective on that.
Mhm. And focusing on the FOMO factor today, all the more relevant because there's so much happening around.
Yes.
You're always thinking, okay, I want this also, I want that also, I can do this as well. But how that influences our choices on the path to potential.
Mm,
How do you work around FOMO in your life? Some examples from
mm,
your life. And you have also featured 6 individuals who
yes.
play to their potential in the book. And
Mm,
from their stories, how did they work around the FOMO, especially Deepak, for people in the creative field? How
mm.
do they, how do you measure all of that?
It's a good question, Deepti. And I think a couple of themes, right? One is each one of us is on an individual journey. Even the 6 people I've profiled, I say they are striving to play to the potential, right? I stop short of saying calling victory and saying they are playing to potential, because in a way it's a
It's a
nebulous topic,
journey.
right? So it's the best we can do is to strive to play to potential. I'll just give a headline on each of these, right? Just for people to get a flavor. One is a chartered accountant, 11th ranker, IIM Ahmedabad, discovered he liked cracking exams, but he did not like finance or consulting. Now he's a storytelling coach based in Pune, Ravi Shankar Iyer. Second is a lady called Sangeeta Shahane, who was a homemaker in the first few years, but at some point lost her husband to cancer, unfortunately, and then decides to set up an SAT coaching practice and is flourishing in Pune. And now the kids have graduated, and now she's sort of finding a different set of things to keep her going. There's Soma Biswas, who's probably a little more of the artistic types. She's a painter, but she comes into B school, uh, grows up in a context of domestic abuse, and for a long time has this notion of fears independence, and says, despite her being passionate about art, says my mission is to be financially independent. But after some time realizes that she's actually falsely holding on to that, and maybe there's a better use of her potential, and now is a arts-based therapist in New York. And that required a little bit of therapy, understanding and coming to terms and coming to peace with it, and really moving art from the background to the foreground. Earlier, she was using art as a distraction and as a harness as she was going through the dark days. But she said, I chose to bring it to the foreground and sort of married my passion and found my purpose. And she works with developmentally challenged children in New York. There is Sumit Mehta, who starts out with PNG for a few years, but then gets disillusioned and wants to do something for education. He's from Pathankot. His father was a teacher, takes a sabbatical, comes back, and now, along with his wife Smita, they run a very successful school tech company called Lead. There is Sucharita Mukherjee, who starts off as a banker but goes through a personal crisis in terms of relationships, decides to reboot, moves from London to India, remarries, starts a microfinance company, and now is a successful fintech entrepreneur and is a mother of two children and runs a family, etc. And the last person is Vineet Panchi, who's a background in hotel management, but is passionate about music, storytelling, voiceover, etc., etc. Now is sort of as a crusader, runs a project called the Jai Hind Project, which is about bringing real life stories to Indians, not real life stories. Is a communications consultant, sort of a branding consultant, and so on. I think these are disparate journeys, but if I sort of zoom out, I think what's common to these people, right? I think one is they've all embarked on an intense journey of understanding themselves and what their motivations are, right? Number one. And sort of going beyond that FOMO factor is not a switch, it's a journey. And for some people, it has been a life event which has triggered that. For some people, maybe it was a relationship upheaval. In my case, I lost my father to cancer, which got me to come back to India and ask some fundamental questions about what mattered to me. For other people, it's a sabbatical, but there's always some sort of a pause which has sort of helped them go back to their roots and really talk about what they matter, what they wanted. Lastly, I would say there's significant resonance between who they are and what they do. There is very little inauthenticity. They are sort of, in a way, they breathe their work and their passion and purpose, and sort of there's a certain coherence to how they lead their life. So I think if I link it back to something I learned from a gentleman called Bob Keegan of Harvard, he's somebody who studied adult development. And he says very early on, we have something called the impulsive mind of a child, which is it's sort of all over the place, it's curious, etc. Then he says we move to an imperial mind of a teenager, where we think we are the center of the universe. Then we move to a socialized mind, which is sort of this whole keeping up with the Joneses, FOMO. This is how the world perceives me, and this is what matters. And some percentage, he says, transitions to what he calls self-authoring mind, which is really saying inside out, this is who I am, this is what matters to me. And less than 1% move to what he calls self-transforming mind, which is Gandhiji's and Nelson Mandela's of the world. Let's keep those aside, right? Those are high bars for us to meet. But the limited point I make is all of us have an opportunity to move from a socialized state, which is sort of living the life that the world wants us to live, to a self-authoring state, to say, this is who I am, these are my values, this is what is important to me, and let me be intentional about architecting a life that's truly valuable to me. So I think I'll pause there, but I think that's what I've learned about living an intentional life and living an inside-out life.
Interestingly, you talked about in all of them, they took a pause in
Yes,
life, right? And that's so important, especially today when so much is happening all around us. The
yes,
importance of taking a pause. And I think you do have one interesting chess kind of metaphor there. Can you talk about that?
yes. I think this is something I had the privilege of talking to Vishwanathan Anand, the chess legend, on my podcast. And he explained this interesting phenomenon in timed chess, where he said very often, if you're playing, I forget the exact terminology of the kind of format, but he says in a lot of these long form chess tournaments, for the first 40 moves, you're given a block of time, let's say 90 minutes or 2 hours. And then what happens is around the 38th or the 39th move, people are also often scrambling for the next move because they are low on time. And you've got 1 minute left, 2 minutes left, and you're sort of quickly making the move and you're sort of racing against the clock. But he says when the move 40 is crossed, suddenly there's a new block of time that's added, half an hour is added, and suddenly that changes the equation. And Bishi went on to say that I would find myself rushing in moves 41 and 42 and making a blunder, and that would cost me the game without acknowledging the fact that the circumstances have changed. So he said, what I've learned to do is to take a pause at move 40, go grab a glass of water or a cup of coffee, go for a quick walk around the room. When you have 30 minutes, maybe losing a minute or two is not a bad thing, just to recenter yourself and sort of come back with a calm mind. And I find that as a useful metaphor in life in general, right? 40 is an interesting time where very often I find we are hit by the multidimensionality of life, right? Intensity of career. Children are often demanding at that time. Parents' health issues sometimes come to the foreground. There are health issues. Our body starts giving feedback to us. So I think that's why I find the pause that Vishy refers to in the context of chess quite relevant in our lives as well, in terms of pausing and reflecting and taking stock and sort of really saying what's important and making adjustments if we need to.
Sure, sure. In the bookshops, the self-help book section is always, crowded, and there are lots of books there as well. And
Hmm.
we have
Hmm.
lots of Western authors and Indian authors there. One is, of course, the uniqueness of your book, how you can differentiate, and you've answered that right at the front of top of the book in your contents, why I wrote this book, and
Hmm.
how is it useful there. And
Hmm.
the popular concepts we've taken up like ikigai, and you've gone on to talk about a little bit about the limitations there, though it
Hmm.
explains how to find your purpose in life. But you've talked about the limitations, maybe in an Indian context, or the idiom, or the Indian
Hmm.
idiom of the book, and how it affects my life in general. Just could you talk a little bit about that? How it, the distinction that you've made, and those 3 points that you make to say that
Yes,
what you find in the book.
sure. Um, Two, three things, Deepti. Clearly, first, I should say that I've been a beneficiary of Ikigai, right? I think post, let's say, my career in executive search, when I was trying to figure out, I think just having that perspective on finding the sweet spot of what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what the world will pay you for, I think it was a clarifying framework. And in a way, it informed some of the choices I made. So I should sort of place that formally on the record. Nothing against it, it's valuable. But what I found was that when I looked around, when I spoke to a lot of my clients and colleagues and friends and relatives and so on, I realized that less than 10% of the people had the, if I may say, the fortune of operating in that sweet spot. Very often, a lot of people had to do jobs to put bread on the table, even if they didn't like the job, because they didn't have the luxury of quitting and meditating and taking a sabbatical and figuring out what they love. Sometimes there are situations where, let's say, there are children of wealthy parents. They don't need to think about what the world needs or what the world will pay you for, right? They can sort of to make a different set of choices. I think the long and short of it was I felt Ikigai was good for a 30,000 feet view. It was a useful lighthouse or a North Star, but I felt it didn't do the job of a torchlight well enough because life is quite messy and there are quite a few twists and turns. And one of my friends, Venki Srinivasan, sent me this lovely clip from the movie Lincoln, which captures the essence of the disconnect, right? There's a point in the movie where Lincoln wants to do something that's borderline devious to achieve an objective. And one of his colleagues asks him, what about your compass? What about your true north? To which Lincoln says, a compass is great. It shows you the true north, but it's got no guidance for the swamps and the ravines and the ditches that you'll encounter along the way. So in the pursuit of the true north, if you sink in a swamp, there's no glory in it. So I think to me that captures the crux of what I'm trying to say, where Ikigai to me is a bit like the true north. Yes, of course, all of us should strive to operate at the sweet spot because it's magical once you get there. But the path to getting there can be messy and non-linear. And, you need a different set of tools to sort of navigate your way to get there. That's sort of point one, macro versus micro. Second is I feel life is filled with transitions, right? I think what I've realized is, there are all kinds of personal transitions we go through, maternity, empty nesting, retirement, loss of a loved one, maybe, fracture in a relationship, whatever. There are multiple transitions we all go through. And Ikigai somehow felt like a static answer. I wanted to provide something that's sort of a little more dynamic, that accounts for the fact that life is fluid and it keeps flowing. And I wanted to put out something that sort of stays with people as they go through the various transitions. And the last point I would say is somehow the language felt like it treated life as a solo sport, right? And the more I look around, I feel people play life as a team sport, the team being family. Now, what is family? I notice varies from case to case. In most cases, it's spouse and children. In some cases, it's parents. In some cases, it's siblings. In some cases, it's extended family. But when I look around and I talk to people, even the 6 case studies I discuss, and I have these YouTube videos which people can access through QR codes, I discovered that a lot of the choices they've made are not in a vacuum, right? It's in the context of something that's brewing in the personal front. So I wanted to put out something that also accounts for this team sport element of life, where the team being the family. So yeah, I think those were the 2, 3 things. Once again, it's not either or, but the limited point I make is that the hammer cannot do the job of a screwdriver and vice versa. So it's use the tool, but use the right tool for the right context.
And then, of course, you've come up with your own sort of guidelines or sort of, milestones, or what should I say, prescription to, lead a flavorful life, and flavorful being OUVR, like FLOVOUR, flavorful life. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Is it okay if I maybe shared my screen just to make
Sure.
make it a little more intuitive? Can you see my screen, Dipti?
Yes, I can.
So this is what I mean, right? So F is what we discussed, tuning into the family context. I see that as a first step right at the top, right? What does it mean in terms of understanding where we come from, our DNA, our wiring, the transitions that are going on in the family, what are the constraints, what are the resources? So that's that piece. L is basically having space for something that we truly love, right? Something that energizes us, something that helps us show up with vitality. That's L. A is aspiration and not ambition, because ambition is often unidimensional, I notice, which is like saying, I want to be an MD, I want to make this much money, or I want to be, this title, etc. Aspiration is saying, these are the various identities I have, and these are the mini goal posts I can set for myself for the next 6 months, 12 months. So how do we move forward in a multidimensional sense? That's aspiration. BO is an interesting one, right? I find that the world of work is also changing quite a bit rapidly. While coming out of campus, we might get clean jobs, right? Like journalist, associate here, trainee here, accountant, etc. But I notice once we cross the 30s and 40s, we all have to go through this, what I call talent market dating process, for us to figure out this is our skills stack, these are the things we have, and these are the things that energize us. How do we interface with the world of opportunity and contribute to the world? So BO is, how do I be of value and seek opportunity, right? How do I come in touch? How do I date with the world of opportunity and be of value? U is investing in yourself, which is physical health, mental health, and capabilities. And R is relationships, not just friends and so on, but also relationships as a pathway to new possibilities. And the word that emerged for me was flavor, right? FLAVOUR, as you can see in the clock. And I don't see it as a straight line. It's sort of interconnected, and these are porous compartments, and they are sort of interconnected. And I think at the center of the circle, just like in ice cream or, in several other food items, we have flavor of the season, right? I say that we also go through seasons. And I say, just like Satya Nadella talks about hit refresh, we all need to hit refresh with our flavor as our life context changes, as the seasons change, as we go through a transition. So what I suggest is every now and then we need to rediscover our flavor as we go through the season. So the question I ask is, what is the flavor of this season? And maybe the answer will evolve as the seasons change. So in a way, I'll pause there, but that's sort of the, if I may say, the crux of what I propose in terms of how to lead a full life.
It is the thing of it's a journey of becoming and not being, I suppose.
Yes,
That-
yes, exactly. And I think the prerequisite for that is self-awareness. And it's a journey, as you rightly say. It's not as if, once again, the wheel of life keeps spinning, right? It's not static. So
yeah.
it's never, you can never say I have arrived, right? Because
Yeah.
then if you say that, then therein lies the contradiction.
Yeah. Deepak, what about your go-to mentors? Do you have any, what sort of, people and books do you look up to?
Yeah, I think the one book that really had an impact on me was How Will You Measure Your Life by Clay Christensen. Somehow it really got me thinking about the various domains of life and how we make choices, and sort of in a way related some of these to the context of business. So that's one book that had a profound impact on me. Another book that had a profound impact on me was Curious Mind by Brian Grazer. He's somebody who's made movies like Beautiful Mind and Apollo 13. So he was the one that really got me thinking about having curiosity conversations with a range of people. So in a way, even the book was the genesis of the podcast. So very grateful. I haven't met him, but the book really changed how I thought about conversations and the value of curiosity. In terms of mentors, in my last organization, a couple of colleagues, Govind Iyer and Neeraj Sagar, and another person called Vivek Khemka, they act as mentors every now and then. I'll give you an example, right? When I set up my own consulting practice, initially I was thinking maybe I should build a large organization, hire some people, etc. Vivek Khemka, I spoke to him and went to him for feedback. And he looked at me and said, Deepak, you seem to have more of a artisanal mindset. Try and become a surgeon, don't build a hospital.
Wow.
Now, it was profound
Yeah.
advice, right? Sometimes when you're at crossroads, you just need somebody to whisper into your ears. It can completely change the direction of whether you turn left or right. Somebody who knows you, somebody who's your well-wisher. Like Ramesh Mangaleshwaran of McKinsey is another mentor. He was a person that looked at me and said, maybe you should consider executive search as a career when I was at McKinsey. At that time, I was evaluating roles like strategic planning roles, venture capital roles, etc. But in a way, I tell them, right, he opened up the 9 3/4 platform for me. If I go back to the Harry Potter metaphor, that platform, that whole world uh, was because was because he saw that element of me and he said, maybe you should do this. So, so I would say these are people I've encountered in my journey, and they sort of you spoke about the upfront section. Why? Uh, I spoke to Rama Bijapurkar, she's a mentor. And when I was writing the manuscript of the book, I took it to her and she said, it's always okay. I'll read the book and make up my mind. Tell me, why did you write the book? I struggled to articulate. She said, if you're not able to articulate that, why would anybody read your book? So in a way, that section exists because thanks to her provocation, I wrote it, and to clarify for myself, but hopefully to clarify for the reader as well. And given that you mentioned at the top of the conversation, hopefully, it made a difference. So I think it's just I've tried to grab on to people. Ravi Venkatesh is another mentor. So whoever I come across who's kind and generous and has a perspective on me, I get selfish and I grab onto them and don't let them go.
Great. We're getting a lot of questions also on from the audience, and we'll not miss out anything. That's what I hope. And it's 6 already. Just one more question, since this is also about writing, where we discuss things about writing and how to approach writing.
Mhm.
How do you approach your creative work, whether it is putting your podcast together or even especially writing this book, because you had to cull so much of data from your
Mm.
podcast, etc.
Mm.
What is your process? What are your writing habits, and sort of, the method in the madness?
Sure. Again, it's my first book, uh, so don't want to claim to be an expert at writing, but I think I realize I do well in the mornings compared to evenings. So I when Penguin asked me to write this book, one of the pieces of advice I got was from Prakash Iyer, who's written many books. He said, "Don't wait for inspiration to strike you. Just sit down first thing in the morning and just say you'll write 500 words or 1,000 words." And I think that advice was useful. I sort of said I blocked off my earlier. I used to do my gym and runs in the morning. I sort of reorganized my life a little bit to say, morning, let me try and see if I can get some deep work done. And I would spend an hour or two just putting out 500,000 words without worrying too much about what I was writing. So I think that was a useful provocation from a process perspective. The other input I got was from Vinay Sitapati, who's been on my podcast a couple of times for a couple of his books, Jugalbandi and Half Lion. He said, you might think editing is a process of trimming, but don't forget that editing can be a generative process. And I think it was a valuable input because initially the book was like almost like structured as essays around potential. You know, I had a section on self-awareness, I had a section on resilience, I had a section on reinventing yourself, one section on identity, and so on. But I sort of came to a point where I was reflecting on why would anybody pick up this book? What is incremental about this? So around that time, Vivek Khemka, who I referred to earlier about that surgeon versus hospital point, he said, is this just a string of pearls or is there a Deepak point of view on this? In a way, that pushed me to think harder about what am I saying. And another friend of mine, Shweta Mani, who played the role of my coach in this writing process, he helped me refine the thought to say, I want to shine the light on playing to full potential. And as I thought about what might be an approach that might make sense, this whole flavor language emerged and I put it out. But the limited point I want to make is with the wisdom of hindsight, I realized that very often even the creative process is a non-linear process. It's not a straight line.
Yeah.
When I started writing it, I said, okay, 60,000 words, 1,000 words a day, 60 days. Okay, keep some buffer. Maybe, you know, instead of 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. So I committed to Penguin 4 months with this sort of rough math in mind. But I didn't quite account for the chaos and the non-linearity and the messiness. So I realized that I've also, you know, if and when I get to the next one, I would embrace the chaos and the messiness of the creative process and sort of take that as feedback. And I realized that even the editing process is a generative process and not a just a trimming process.
Sure, sure. So have you already started work on your next one, and what is it about?
No, not at all. I think still digesting this and yeah, again, I haven't even this whole idea. I'm sort of this new identity of an author is still settling in. Um, but let's see. I feel somehow I take inspiration from people like Christopher Nolan, where you know it's not the frequency but the depth of the work. So maybe 5 years down the line, I at least nothing in the immediate horizon is something I would say.
So before we move on to the audience question, we have a quick rapid fire round, which we call shots round.
Okay.
And just I'll fire away right away. Your all-time favorite book?
I spoke about this. How will you measure your life? By Clay Christensen.
Morning person or night owl? I think that also you answered.
Definitely.
Morning.
Unequivocally morning.
You're talking to a night owl.
No, I have a night owl at home. So maybe a piece of random trivia. I think that some of the best conversations we've had was when I was in India and she was in the US, and my mornings and her nights. So we discovered that our conversations had the highest energy.
The biggest myth about self-help?
I think the biggest myth is often the statement, right, that you can ask somebody else to change. The starting point of change has to be, I want to change.
Your go-to reset on a tough day?
Nature, I would say. I mean, I live in Bombay, so nature sometimes can be hard. So just a walk or a run, just a little bit of the outdoors. I feel outdoors, and I live in a community where there's a walking track. Just a little bit of moving from the inside to the outside, I feel helps with the reset.
What's that one habit you can't live without?
Taking notes. I just feel right from my school days, I would just, when somebody's talking, I had this habit of taking notes. Even when I was in a consulting firm, when I was an associate, when you go to a partner's room, I would be told, just ensure you take good notes because you don't get time with the partner again. Uh, Even when I'm doing a podcast, when I'm in a meeting, I somehow like to scribble. And I think it's not just the act of learning, but I think there is something about the how the mind works and the act of putting pen to paper. So I just got this thing called the Remarkable, which is a digital note-taking device. So just taking notes is something that's a habit that's I find helpful.
Wonderful. So quickly, I'll move on to some of the questions here. Kirti asks, what are some introspective questions that help people discover the areas they have maximum potential in? What
Mm.
question should we ask ourselves?
Actually, there is a section in the book where I outline 10 questions in chapter 3 in internal self-awareness and chapter 4 as well. But I think the one thing I would say, Kirti, right? Or Kriti,
Kirti.
Kirti. I think very often introspection, we think about strengths and weaknesses, strengths and development areas, but I would urge people to think a little more about superpowers, right? When are you distinctive? What are the things that only you can do? What brings you joy in the last 12 months? When have you been happiest? Those are the kinds of questions where you will probably discover the answers to where to go. Because strengths and development areas are often around how you can do better and wherever you are. But I find the real disruption or the real opportunity is in figuring out the right mountain to climb rather than becoming a better climber. So some of these questions about where you're distinctive, when are you in flow, what are your superpowers? And I think the additional point I might make is combine reflection with healthy level of feedback, because very often some of these questions, people around us might see us better than we see ourselves. So if you can balance the process of introspection with outside and feedback, and not just at work, right? This could be friends, family. I noticed that one of the chapters, as you know, Deepti, is how 360 is your 360. The people at work are just a very small sliver of the world we interact with. We have friends, we have family members who see us. So just get hold of those loving critics, people who care for you, but will give you honest feedback and gather insights around some of these dimensions.
Mhm. Mayuri asks, your book is titled Play to Potential. So if life is a game, what are the most important rules we should know?
I think I go back to Simon Sinek, right? I think he's written a book called The Infinite Game. And the crux of what he says is the infinite game. Unfortunately, the rules are not known, you know. So I think what are the rules we should know? I think one I would say is life is not static, it's flowing. So just having that humility that what works for you today may not work tomorrow. So just evolution doesn't stop. And as you rightly said, it's a process of becoming. So number one, I think life is like a river and keeps flowing, and just be open to everything that comes along your way. Second is, I think, goes back to John Lennon, right? I think there's a beautiful song, words in a song, life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans, right? So just the other point I would say is just while you plan, we have a certain sense of humility about how much happens outside our control. Um, and third, I would say is just, I think the answer is in the word play, right? You can't work to potential. So try and keep asking yourself what feels like play and do more and more of it. And hopefully you will find your way to your potential.
I hope that answers her question. Juhi asks, what advice would you give someone feeling stuck in their career or life?
Wow, that's deeply contextual, right? So I would say get help is the first thing that says, because very often I find that this is a lovely term I heard from a gentleman called Bruce Feiler, who's written a book, Life is in the Transitions. He says when you're at a dinner table, and let's say there are two siblings, and once one child starts narrating a story of what happened in school, this happened, that happened. Quickly, the other sibling corrects, no, no, that's not what happened. You bullied that guy. So the term he says is co-narration. Sometimes when we have somebody else look at the same facts, they're able to come up with a different perspective or a different set of observations or insights. So in these situations, I generally say very often I notice that we might have a narrative which might be distorted. So try and get some help. Could it be a coach? Could it be a friend? Could it be a counselor? Could it be a therapist? Varies from case to case. But don't too many people I find try to solve it alone, and that sometimes can be frustrating and suboptimal.
Mhm.
And another term I came across was from a lady called Amy Edmondson of Harvard Business School. She uses the term naive realism. And she says that we all look at the world and we think our view of the world is the only version. But there are different versions of the world. So I think very often we get stuck with just our aperture, but sometimes just widening the lens and getting more people into the situation might give us other perspectives and other maybe levers to work with.
Mhm. Meera Chavan asks, Hi Deepak, what does your typical day look like when you're working on a project like this book?
Yeah, I think the book was there. I think the podcast was also going on. And then I had my advisory work as well, which puts bread on the table, right? I couldn't. So what I did was I realized that writing the book would consume time. So with podcasts, I had to create some additional bandwidth. Uh, I didn't want to sort of compromise too much on the family front and sit in a cave and write the book, right? So I said in the podcast, instead of having new conversations and collecting new dots, let me connect the dots. I've already had 100 conversations. Let me try and make meaning. So in a way, that sort of reduced a little bit of the intensity on the podcast front and opened up some bandwidth. I also sort of said no to much more work to create bandwidth from my advisory work. So the first 2 to 3 hours, let's say, I would say till about 10 or 11 would be creative work around the book. Then I would say the next 1 or 2 hours might be some work around the podcast. The second half, I would say the calls and the meetings, I tried and kept it as a post-lunch activity, which was the advisory. Again, no day is a typical day, but first step one is I had to create some bandwidth from my current work for the book. Say no to much more work. For example, I love playing cricket. There was a cricket tournament in my community. I played 2 years back. Last year, I would love to play, but I said no because I had this book. So sometimes, time is finite and I had to say no to a few things. But that's sort of what my day looked like.
Mhm. Janisha Patel asks, I'm curious, was there any unexpected lessons you discovered while researching for your book? Some myths that were broken, some myths that were destroyed.
I think the one of the myths I spoke about, right, myth around the creative process, right? I felt it was a straight line, and I think I felt, it's like they talk about the calm before the storm. I think in my case, there was a storm before the calm, right? So I had to go through that mess to really arrive at what I wanted to say. So that was something, if you ask me 1 year back, I would have said, yeah, 6,000 words, 1,000 words a day, 60 days, 90 days, done. But now I think I have a little more humility about the emergent property. I think the second piece I would say is I've developed greater conviction in the fact that things like passion and purpose are emergent. Asking, they're not things that we know on day one. Like asking somebody what's your purpose on day one feels a bit like asking a 5-year-old what you want to become when you're 40 years old. So I've said, let's work with, rather than focusing on what's your passion, let's focus on what gives you joy, what you love. Passion will emerge. Rather than asking what's your purpose, you say, where do you want to be? Where do you want to contribute? Where do you want to add value? And purpose will evolve. So somehow, I think the book has helped me move from the macro to the micro, and the macro over time will get taken care of.
Mhm. Ayush Sharma asks, what framework tools do you use in your day-to-day life to keep you on track with your goals and aspirations?
I do have a to-do list, which keeps me on track. But I also have some sort of a to-be list in my mind. What I mean by that is to be patient, to be a good listener, to be tolerant, and that varies from case to case. So let's say 3 years back, I would have just had a to-do list, but now I combine my to-do list with maybe 3 or 4 to be elements because I feel effectiveness is not just about what we do, but also how we do. So I feel of late I've started tuning into not just the what, but also the how of getting things done.
Mhm. But you said any tech tools that you use for these things, to make it all very simple instead of just writing it on a notebook, or do you just write it in a notebook?
I think I tried many things. Like I tried Evernote. I have this digital writing thing called Remarkable. The one thing I do, for example, even with WhatsApp, right? I think, for example, I pin three messages. So I say, okay, rather than unread, I realize that at any point in time, I can focus on three. So three things that need to get done. If there are messages on WhatsApp, I just pin them and I send messages to myself. So from a tech perspective, actually, I have a WhatsApp conversation with myself. There's a Deepak to Deepak, Karthik calling Karthik kind of a thing.
Yeah, yeah.
So that to me, uh, I sort of work off that list. Nothing fancy. No app, no nothing. But I think, as I said, to me, the magic is in the to be list, not just in the to do list.
Mhm. No, in the book, there is one point where one of Tim Ferriss's podcasts, I think you talk
Yes,
about, I'm forgetting who his guest was,
Jim
but
Collins.
yes, and they talk about that I found very fascinating, and I think I'll attempt it. But can you talk a little bit about that? What he did with this Excel sheet and how he arrived at
Yes, I think this was Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great and management, respected management thinker on the Jim Collins podcast. And he says this very often. I think the crux of the insight, Deepti, is that he says that we are very poor judges of, why we feel high or low on a certain day. So he says decouple capturing the data from making meaning. So what Jim Collins says is, he says he records what all the 4, 5 things he does in a day, right? At the end of the day, he just notes down, these are the 4, 5 things I got done. And then he says, I give myself a score of -2 to +2. A +2 is a very good day, -2 is a bad day, right? So he says, I do that for a period of 16 months, 60 days or 90 days. And then he says, I just accumulate all the +2s, right? All the days, maybe out of the 90 days, 20 days were +2s. So he accumulates all the +2s and looks at the qualitative comments. And then he says, what is it about these days which made it special for me? Let me sort of now try and reflect. And he says that very often the reasons are very different from what you would have thought. It might have just been I had a good breakfast, or it might just be that I had a good night's sleep, or it might be because I walked the dog in the morning, and that gave me positive vibes. So I think, and this is something I learned from Tasha Eurich as well, another person who's written a book called Insight. And she says that even when we are meditating or journaling, focus on the what, not on the monkey mind will quickly go to the why because we're used to analyzing and overanalyzing. But stay with the what and collect data for a period of time and then start making meaning with the why. That was the crux of what Jim Collins says in the Tim Ferriss podcast.
Mhm. So I think we just take one more question. We are out of time now. Giles asks, do you believe everyone has untapped potential? If so, how can we discover it?
Yeah, I think my take on this is rather than very often potential is seen as a binary term, right? Has it or doesn't have it. But the real magic is in asking the question potential for what? I feel all of us have a potential for something. And that's why I feel beyond a point in time, answering where to go is a better question than how to grow, right? Because I find, and sometimes it can be an easy process, sometimes it can be a tough, messy, frustrating process. But human potential, all of us have a potential for something, right? I think there is this, if I may present a page just in response to that. Just give me 1 second, right? Right now, if I told you in javelin, uh, these are the two numbers, right? One person threw 89.45, the other person threw 47.32. Who's a better javelin thrower? You would say, yeah, the person that threw 89 is a better javelin thrower, right? This is Neeraj Chopra and this is Navdeep Singh, right? Now it turns out that Neeraj won the silver for this throw in Paris, and Navdeep won a gold in the Paralympics category for this throw of 47.32. The point I want to make is all of us are given a certain set of cards. Now, this is just a javelin is a very simplistic example, but sometimes we need to say, given who we are, given the context, given the resources, given the finances, given our skill sets, given our physical ability, mental ability, what is the best we can do, and what is the canvas? Now, if Navdeep had participated in the mainstream Olympics, no, and he would have been nowhere near qualification. So I think again, it's a very, it doesn't quite capture the complexity of the issue. But the limited point I want to make is, are we finding the right canvas where we can flourish. And that's a journey. It's a messy journey a lot of times. But to me, everybody has potential. The question is figuring out potential for what
Correct.
and where.
Wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure our audiences also did, judging from the questions. And thank you so much, Deepak, again for taking time out. And thank you to the Thinkly team as well for organizing this. And thank you to all of you who joined. Till we meet again with another guest. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Deepti. Really enjoyed the conversation.